Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are covering a range of stories that, on the surface, look unrelated, but dig a little deeper and you'll find a common thread running through every single one of them. Power, money, and the question of who gets to write the rules.
I'm Maya Clarity, and we have a packed show tonight. From a gruesome murder case in Bali finally reaching its conclusion, to ByteDance smashing valuation records at $550 billion, to President Trump threatening to blow up North America's trade architecture, his State of the Union address, and deadly violence erupting in Syria's Alawite heartland. Stay with us, this is going to be a deep dive.
Let's start with something that's going to sound like a true crime podcast, but it's very real and it just happened. A U.S. man named Tommy Schaefer has been deported from Indonesia after spending 11 years behind bars for what became known internationally as the suitcase murder. He killed his then-girlfriend's mother, Sheila Von Wiesmack, during a luxury holiday on the island of Bali back in 2014.
And Alex, I want to emphasize that phrase, luxury holiday. This wasn't some backpacker dispute. This was a wealthy American family vacation on one of the world's most beautiful islands, and it ended with a woman's body stuffed into a suitcase and left in the trunk of a taxi outside a five-star hotel. The contrast between the setting and the crime is what made this case a global headline.
Let's walk through the facts as reported by The Guardian. Tommy Schaefer was originally sentenced to 18 years in an Indonesian prison for the premeditated murder of Sheila Von Wiesmack. He was convicted alongside his then-girlfriend, Heather Mack, who was Von Wiesmack's daughter. The murder took place in August 2014 at the St. Regis Hotel in Nusa Dua, Bali. Schaefer beat Von Wiesmack to death, and the couple then stuffed her body into a large suitcase.
Now here's where it gets legally interesting. Schaefer served 11 years of that 18-year sentence. In Indonesia, prisoners can receive sentence reductions for good behavior and participation in rehabilitation programs. This is a standard practice in the Indonesian justice system, it's not unique to this case. But it does raise a question that comes up every single time a high-profile foreign prisoner gets released early. Did the system work the way it was supposed to, or did privilege play a role?
That's the right question, Maya. Because let's remember the other half of this case. Heather Mack, Schaefer's then-girlfriend and the victim's own daughter, was sentenced to 10 years for her role in the murder. She was released and deported back to the United States in 2021 after serving about 7 years. And when she got back to American soil, she was promptly arrested by federal authorities and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. She was eventually sentenced to 26 years in a U.S. federal prison.
So think about that. Heather Mack got a lighter sentence in Indonesia, came home, and ended up with a far harsher sentence from American courts. That tells you something about the difference in how these two justice systems weigh the same crime. And now Schaefer is being deported back to the U.S. The big question is whether American federal prosecutors have anything waiting for him when he lands.
Exactly. And I think listeners should understand the backstory here. Sheila Von Wiesmack was the widow of jazz musician James L. Mack. She was a wealthy woman from Chicago. According to multiple reports at the time of the trial, the relationship between Schaefer and the Von Wiesmack family was deeply troubled. There were allegations that Sheila disapproved of Tommy's relationship with her daughter, and that financial disputes were a major source of tension.
The prosecution in Indonesia argued that Schaefer killed Von Wiesmack after a confrontation in the hotel room. He used a metal fruit bowl to bludgeon her to death. The couple then attempted to flee with the body concealed in the suitcase. They were caught relatively quickly. A taxi driver noticed blood leaking from the suitcase in the trunk of his cab and alerted authorities. It was, frankly, one of the most poorly executed cover-ups in modern criminal history.
And that's what made it such a sensation. The brutality of the act, the absurdity of the attempted cover-up, the luxury setting, and the family dynamics, a daughter complicit in her own mother's murder. This case had every element that draws international media attention. But at its core, a woman lost her life, and the question of whether justice has been fully served is one that Sheila Von Wiesmack's extended family and friends are still grappling with tonight.
The broader pattern here, Alex, and this is something we see repeatedly, is the complexity of cross-border criminal justice. When an American commits a crime abroad, serves time abroad, and then gets deported, there's a jurisdictional tangle that can either lead to additional accountability or to someone slipping through the cracks. Heather Mack didn't slip through. We'll be watching to see if Tommy Schaefer does.
Now let's shift gears dramatically, from a crime of passion to the cold, calculated world of big tech valuations. ByteDance, the Chinese parent company of TikTok, has reportedly hit a record valuation of $550 billion US. That's billion with a B, Maya, and it's a number that should make everyone sit up and pay attention.
Let me put that in context. According to reporting from the South China Morning Post, the The valuation comes from a proposed equity sale by U.S. private equity firm General Atlantic. They're selling a stake in ByteDance at a price that values the entire company at $550 billion. Reuters confirmed this through two unnamed sources. And this follows SCMP's own earlier reporting from December that ByteDance's private market valuation had already surged to $500 billion, up from $400 billion as recently as the second quarter of 2025.
So in roughly 6 months, ByteDance added $150 billion in perceived value. To put that in perspective, that increase alone is worth more than most companies on the planet. We're talking about a private company, not publicly traded, that is now valued higher than most of the publicly traded tech giants. This puts ByteDance in the same conversation as Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, and Amazon.
And here's the tension that makes this story so much more than a business headline. This is happening while TikTok remains under intense political scrutiny in the United States. The forced divestiture battle, the national security concerns, the back and forth between Washington and Beijing over who gets to control one of the most influential media platforms on Earth, all of that is the backdrop against which investors are saying, yes, we think this company is worth more than $500 billion.
Let's talk about General Atlantic for a moment, because the identity of the seller matters. General Atlantic is one of the most prominent growth equity firms in the world, based in New York. They've been investors in ByteDance for years. The fact that they're selling a stake at this valuation tells you two things. First, they believe the market will bear this price, there are buyers willing to pay it. Second, they may be taking profits at what they see as a peak, or they may be rebalancing their portfolio amid the political uncertainty.
The buyers matter too, and we don't yet know all of them. But when you see a deal at this level in the private market, you're talking about sovereign wealth funds, major institutional investors, and other private equity firms. These are sophisticated players who are making a bet that ByteDance's revenue machine, TikTok's advertising business, Douyin's dominance in China, and their growing AI capabilities, will continue to generate enormous returns regardless of the political noise.
And that's the key insight. The valuation is the market's way of saying that ByteDance has become too big and too profitable to be derailed by any single government's actions. Whether it's a US ban, a forced sale, or new regulations, the investors are betting that ByteDance will navigate through it. That's either a vote of confidence in the company's resilience, or it's a sign that global capital has become so detached from geopolitical reality that it's pricing in a fantasy.
I'd argue it's somewhere in between, Alex. ByteDance is genuinely one of the most impressive technology companies built in the last 2 decades. Their algorithm is best in class. Their revenue growth has been extraordinary. But there's also an element of speculative frenzy in private markets right now, where valuations can climb without the discipline that public market scrutiny imposes. When a company isn't publicly traded, there's no daily price discovery, no short sellers, no quarterly earnings calls. The valuation is whatever the last transaction says it is.
And at $550 billion, that last transaction is speaking very loudly. We'll continue to follow this story as the deal progresses. Now, speaking of geopolitical chess, let's move to one of the most consequential trade stories of the year. President Trump is reportedly considering pulling the United States out of the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, and analysts are warning that this move could push Canada directly into China's arms.
This is a story that deserves far more attention than it's getting, Alex. The USMCA, for those who need a refresher, replaced NAFTA. It was actually one of Trump's signature achievements during his first term. He renegotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement and rebranded it. So the irony here is thick. The man who created this deal is now reportedly considering blowing it up.
According to the South China Morning Post's reporting, Washington, Ottawa, and Mexico City are set to renegotiate the terms of the USMCA before a possible extension deadline on July 1. Bloomberg reported earlier this month that Trump was quietly considering exiting the trade deal entirely. And analysts are now warning that if the US walks away from its closest trading partners, Canada in particular will have no choice but to diversify, and that means turning to China.
Let's unpack why this matters so much. Canada and the United States have one of the largest bilateral trading relationships in the world. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in goods and services flowing across that border every year. The Canadian economy is deeply integrated with the American economy, energy, automotive manufacturing, agriculture, technology. If you pull the rug out from under that relationship, Canada doesn't just sit there and take it. They look for alternatives.
And the most obvious alternative is China. Beijing has been actively courting middle powers for years, offering trade deals, infrastructure investment, and market access. Canada has historically been cautious about deepening economic ties with China, partly out of loyalty to the US alliance and partly because of genuine concerns about Chinese government practices. But if the United States tells Canada, we don't value this relationship enough to maintain our trade agreement, then Ottawa's calculus changes dramatically.
One analyst quoted in the reporting described it as Canada moving into China's arms as a hedge. That word, hedge, is important. It doesn't mean Canada would abandon the U.S. relationship entirely. It means Canada would actively build economic relationships with China as insurance against American unreliability. And once those ties are built, they develop their own momentum. They become self-sustaining. You don't just turn them off when the White House changes hands.
This is the fundamental problem with transactional foreign policy, Maya. When you treat your closest allies as adversaries in a negotiation, you erode the trust that holds alliances together. And once that trust is gone, it takes a generation to rebuild. Canada isn't the only country watching this. Every U.S. ally in the world, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the European Union, is asking itself the same question: can we rely on the United States, or do we need a plan B?
And here's another layer. Trump has also implemented a new global 15% tariff. But as the reporting notes, this tariff has little immediate impact on many countries due to existing trade agreements. So you have a situation where the tariff is more symbolic than substantive for some partners, but the threat to the USMCA is very real and very consequential. It's the threat that's doing the damage, not the tariff itself.
The business community in all three countries is watching this with deep concern. Supply chains that took decades to build don't redirect overnight, but the uncertainty alone is enough to freeze investment decisions. If you're a manufacturer trying to decide where to build your next plant, and you don't know whether the North American trade framework will exist in 6 months, you pause. You wait. And that waiting has real economic costs: lost jobs, delayed projects, reduced growth.
And the geopolitical implications extend beyond economics. The USMCA isn't just a trade deal. It's a pillar of North American integration, a framework that binds three countries together in ways that enhance collective security, coordinate regulatory standards, and create a unified economic bloc that can compete with China. If you dismantle that framework, you don't just lose trade benefits. You lose strategic coherence.
Now let's turn to what happened on Capitol Hill last night. President Trump delivered his State of the Union address, and as Al Jazeera reported, the speech both aggravated and excited lawmakers. That's a diplomatic way of saying it was one of the most divisive State of the Union addresses in modern memory.
Let's set the scene, Alex. The State of the Union is traditionally a moment when the President addresses the full Congress, the Supreme Court justices, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Cabinet, and the American public. It's supposed to be an assessment of where the country stands and a vision for where it's going. And in practice, it's always political. But the question is always one of degree: how political, how partisan, how confrontational.
From what we've seen in the reporting, Trump used the address to double down on his administration's key policy priorities. We're talking about the tariff agenda, immigration enforcement, government spending cuts through the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, and foreign policy positions that have alarmed traditional allies. The speech was a victory lap for his base and a provocation for his critics.
What struck me was the reaction in the chamber. You had Republicans giving standing ovations, and Democrats sitting in stony silence or openly expressing displeasure. That's not unusual for a State of the Union, but the intensity of the divide reflects something deeper. We're not just looking at policy disagreements anymore. We're looking at fundamentally different visions of what the country is and what it should be.
And the substance matters beyond the theater. When the President of the United States uses the State of the Union to signal that he's willing to exit trade agreements with allies, to impose blanket tariffs, to dramatically restructure the federal government, these aren't just talking points. These are policy signals that move markets, shift diplomatic relationships, and affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people.
The international audience for this speech is just as important as the domestic one. Every foreign leader, every finance minister, every intelligence agency in the world was watching and parsing every word. When Trump signals a direction in a State of the Union, other countries start making contingency plans. The Canadian story we just discussed is a direct example of that. The speech doesn't happen in a vacuum, it triggers responses around the globe.
One of the key themes that emerged was the administration's framing of its agenda as a battle against an entrenched establishment. That narrative resonates powerfully with a large segment of the American public that feels left behind by globalization, by technological change, by institutions that seem to serve the powerful rather than the people. Whether or not the administration's policies actually address those grievances is a separate question, but the messaging is effective.
And that effectiveness is precisely what concerns critics. The argument from the other side is that the administration is using populist rhetoric to justify policies that actually concentrate power further, tax policies that benefit the wealthy, deregulation that empowers corporations, and government restructuring that weakens oversight and accountability. It's the oldest trick in the political playbook: tell people you're fighting for them while serving someone else.
We should note that Al Jazeera's coverage highlighted the reactions of lawmakers from both parties, and the general sense that this speech marked a hardening of positions on all sides. There's very little middle ground left in American politics, and the State of the Union made that painfully clear. The question going forward is whether any of the policy proposals outlined in the speech can actually pass through Congress, or whether we're looking at more executive action and more constitutional confrontation.
And with midterm elections on the horizon, every single word of that speech will be weaponized by both parties. Democrats will use it to energize their base. Republicans will use it to rally theirs. The American public, as usual, is caught in the crossfire of a political class that seems more interested in winning the next election than governing the country. That's not a partisan statement, that's a structural critique of American democracy in its current form.
Now let's turn to a story that's getting far less attention than it deserves. Deadly fighting has broken out in Latakia, Syria, the heartland of the Alawite community and the power base of the Assad regime. According to Al Jazeera, several people were killed in fighting where suspected Assad regime supporters attacked security forces.
Alex, this story requires some crucial context. Syria has been through over a decade of civil war. The Assad regime, backed by Russia and Iran, maintained control over much of the country through brutal force. The Alawite community, a minority Shia Muslim sect, formed the backbone of Assad's support base and dominated the security apparatus. Latakia, on the Mediterranean coast, has always been considered Assad territory, the place where the regime felt most secure.
So when we hear about suspected Assad regime supporters attacking security in Latakia, we need to understand what that means in the current context. This suggests that remnants of the old regime, or elements loyal to Assad, are actively challenging whatever governing authority is now in place. It's a sign that the post-conflict transition, if we can even call it that, is deeply unstable and potentially violent.
The situation in Syria is one of the most complex humanitarian and geopolitical crises of our time, and it rarely gets the attention it deserves in Western media. You have multiple armed factions, foreign military interventions by Turkey, Russia, Iran, and the United States, millions of displaced people, and a shattered infrastructure. The fighting in Latakia is a reminder that the conflict is not over, it has simply evolved.
And the Alawite dimension is particularly sensitive. If this fighting represents a broader uprising by Alawite communities against new security forces, we could be looking at a sectarian conflict within what was already a multi-sided civil war. The Alawite community fears collective punishment for the crimes of the Assad regime, and that fear can drive desperate actions.
What concerns me is the potential for escalation. Latakia isn't just any city, it's home to Russia's Khmeimim Air Base, one of Moscow's most important military installations outside of Russia itself. Any instability in the region directly affects Russian strategic interests, which means Moscow will be paying very close attention. And where Russian interests are threatened, Russian military responses tend to follow.
The humanitarian angle is equally urgent. The people of Latakia and the surrounding coastal region have already endured enormous suffering. Many of them are internally displaced from other parts of Syria. If full-scale fighting breaks out in what has been one of the relatively more stable areas of the country, the displacement crisis will worsen dramatically. And the international community, frankly, has shown limited appetite for addressing the Syrian crisis in any comprehensive way.
This story also connects to a broader pattern we're seeing in the Middle East and North Africa, the fragility of post-conflict transitions. Whether it's Libya, Yemen, Iraq, or Syria, the pattern is the same. A strongman falls or weakens, and the vacuum left behind is filled not by democratic institutions but by competing armed factions, sectarian militias, and foreign powers pursuing their own agendas. Latakia may be the latest chapter in that deeply troubling story.
And with the world's attention focused on trade wars and domestic politics in Washington, these kinds of crises get buried. But they shouldn't. The people being killed in Latakia tonight are just as worthy of our attention as any trade valuation or political speech. That's what journalism is supposed to do, make sure no story gets lost in the noise.
Absolutely. Now Alex, let's step back and do what we do best on this show, connect the dots. Because when you lay these 5 stories side by side, a pattern emerges that I think is deeply revealing about the state of the world in February 2026.
Let's start with the most obvious thread, power and its consequences. In Bali, we have the consequence of interpersonal power, a violent act driven by control, money, and family dysfunction, with justice playing out across 2 different legal systems over more than a decade. In the ByteDance story, we have the consequence of corporate power, a company so massive that its valuation exceeds the GDP of most nations, operating in the gray zone between 2 superpowers. In the USMCA story and the State of the Union, we have the consequence of political power wielded without regard for long-term alliances or stability.
And in Syria, we have the consequence of power lost, the violent aftershocks that follow when an authoritarian regime crumbles, and the people left behind are caught between old loyalties and new realities. Every one of these stories is about who holds power, how they use it, and what happens when that power shifts.
The second thread is accountability, or the lack of it. Tommy Schaefer served 11 years for murder and is now a free man. Will he face further consequences in the US, or will he disappear from public view? ByteDance has grown to a $500 billion valuation while operating under what many governments consider opaque and potentially compromising data practices. Who holds them accountable? The President of the United States can threaten to exit trade agreements that affect millions of lives on a whim. Who checks that power?
And in Syria, the perpetrators of some of the worst atrocities of the 21st century, chemical weapons attacks on civilians, barrel bombings of hospitals, systematic torture in detention facilities, have largely escaped accountability. The fighting in Latakia is, in part, a consequence of that failure. When there's no justice, there's no peace. That's not a slogan, it's an observable fact, playing out in real time.
The third thread, and this is the one that keeps me up at night, is the erosion of international norms and institutions. The USMCA was supposed to be the framework for North American economic cooperation. The international criminal justice system was supposed to hold war criminals accountable. The global tech regulatory framework was supposed to keep companies like ByteDance from becoming ungovernable. All of these systems are under enormous strain, and none of them are performing the way they were designed to.
What we're witnessing, Alex, is the cost of a world where short-term thinking dominates. Every one of these stories involves actors, governments, corporations, individuals, making decisions based on immediate advantage rather than long-term consequence. Trump threatens to exit the USMCA because he thinks it gives him leverage in a negotiation. ByteDance investors pile in because the next quarter's revenue looks good. Assad supporters fight because they see no path to reconciliation. And the world gets a little more fragmented, a little more unstable, every single day.
And yet, there's a counter-narrative here too. The fact that we can sit here and connect these stories, the fact that journalists around the world, from The Guardian to the South China Morning Post to Al Jazeera, are reporting these facts, means that transparency still exists. The truth is still being documented. The question is whether anyone with power is listening, and whether public awareness can still translate into public pressure.
That's exactly right. And that's why shows like this matter. Not because we have the power to change policy directly, but because an informed public is the only real check on unchecked power. Whether it's a murder in Bali, a $500 billion tech valuation, a trade war, a political speech, or fighting in the streets of a Syrian city, the common thread is that the people affected by these events deserve to understand what's happening and why.
So here's our call to action tonight. Don't let these stories wash over you. The suitcase murder case is a reminder that justice is never simple and rarely complete. Follow the story to see whether American prosecutors act. The ByteDance valuation is a signal that corporate power is outpacing the ability of governments to regulate it. Demand that your representatives take tech regulation seriously. The USMCA threat is a warning that economic alliances are fragile. Insist that trade policy be made with long-term strategy, not short-term bravado.
Pay attention to the State of the Union not as spectacle but as policy. Hold your elected officials accountable for the promises made and the implications of the positions taken. And do not forget Syria. Do not let the world's attention deficit allow another humanitarian catastrophe to unfold in silence. The people of Latakia, like all people caught in conflict, deserve more than a headline that disappears in 24 hours.
That's our show for tonight. I'm Alex Truth, reminding you that the truth doesn't care about your politics, your portfolio, or your comfort level. It just is. And our job, yours and mine, is to face it head on.
And I'm Maya Clarity. We'll be back tomorrow night with more stories the powerful would rather you didn't hear. Until then, stay informed, stay critical, and never stop asking questions. Good night.